Hello, good morning. The Chancellor Jeremy Hunt is set to unveil a budget aimed at boosting efforts to get people back to work. And what he's calling a budget for growth, the Chancellor is expected to announce a major expansion of childcare support, as well as other incentives to help improve productivity. But the day will also be marked by a series of nationwide strikes as doctors, teachers and civil servants continue their demands for better pay. We'll hear more about that day of action shortly. But first, more on what we can expect from the budget. Well, it's likely that support for energy bills will be extended for another 3 months. All eyes will be on any announcement around public sector pay, as thousands of workers continue to strike. It's understood the government could increase the amount people can hold in their pensions without it being taxed. It's expected free childcare will be expanded to cover 1- and 2-year-olds in England. And turning to business, the government has already announced its plans to incentivise investment, with £80 million allocated to 12 locations across the UK. And defence spending will increase to £5 billion over the next 2 years. With more, here's our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates.
How do you reignite the British economy?
Right, gentlemen, what we're doing today is you're carrying all your fitting tasks.
At this factory in Walsall, they're manufacturing the workers of tomorrow. Labour shortages are holding back companies across the country.
I think Mark's what is currently surface grinding to get that down to tolerance.
Here they train hundreds of engineers, young and old, the skills they need to fill the gaps.
Local businesses are furious, really, that we've got these skill shortages. Over recent years, especially during the pandemic, you saw a lot of people either being made redundant, furloughed, or realised they were at such a point in life where they could actually exit engineering manufacturing and retire. So what we're trying to do here is achieve by reskilling them quickly to come back into the sector.
One of the big drivers of the UK labour shortage is a rise in early retirements. The Chancellor says he wants to get the over 50s off the golf course and back into jobs. This budget will raise the tax-free pension allowance to £1.8 million, a financial carrot to keep the already well-off in work. For those enjoying a round of golf here, it could be a hard sell.
I don't think anything would have made me delay retirement. I think there's a lot of people who would probably like to retire early, and I think I would call myself living in the golden age where I actually could.
If you've paid into a pension for all those years and the way that pensions are calculated, it doesn't make sense to stay on for a lot of people, you know.
Most of us here are probably in a fairly privileged position, but, you know, to a lot of people, they could make some changes, like the pensions changes possibly in the budget. That will probably keep some people at work, where at the moment, you know, they maybe retire.
Cash for pensions and for parents too. An extra £4 billion, which the government claims will fund 30 hours of childcare a week for 1- and 2-year-olds. A cautious welcome, but questions over whether the Chancellor's sums add up.
Investment of this scale could be a real game changer for families who are struggling with their eye-watering childcare bills. However, we do need to make sure that it's funded at a level that covers the true cost of childcare.
The authors of this budget don't expect it to be a game changer. Measures on pensions and on childcare targeting the same problem: how to keep people in work and helping the economy grow. Will it be enough? Sam Coates, Sky News.
Well, let's just bring you some news just in before we talk to our political correspondent, Tamara Cohen. And the energy price guarantee, this is a thing that keeps households' bills at a set level. It has been kept at £2,500 for an additional 3 months from April to June. The government saying that this should save a typical household £160. It was widely trailed, but it has just been confirmed by the government. Let's get more now with our political correspondent, Tamara Cohen, who's at Downing Street. Confirmation of this policy, Tamara, but what else are we expecting to see in the budget today?
Morning, Jane. Well, that is part of a package that the Chancellor hopes will help people who are struggling with the cost of living. They believe it will take another 3 months for the drop in wholesale gas prices to feed through to people's bills. So you'll get additional support with those, but that is to prevent bills rising by as high as they would have done. As for how life will be easier, the Chancellor has said that one of the aims of this budget is to get people back to work. And we learnt last night that he's planning a big expansion of free childcare for 1- and 2-year-olds who will get 30 free hours if both their parents are working, in the hope that parents and even grandparents will be able to either come back to work or increase their hours and give the economy a boost. Now, of course, parents and of course providers will be looking very carefully at whether the numbers stack up there, but potentially that could be a very big game changer for the Conservatives. As for those who don't have young children or won't benefit from these pension changes, the Chancellor has made very clear that getting inflation down is his priority, so there won't be big tax cuts for individual taxes, and he also is not minded to reverse the rise in corporation tax that's coming in April. That's been the focus of a lot of grumbling from Conservative MPs. When he talks about this being a budget for growth, he will introduce other business tax breaks, particularly for what he calls the businesses of the future. But I think the focus today in his first budget will be whether he can make a tangible difference either on the cost of living or growth within the next 18 months before we expect there will be a general election.
OK, Tamara, thanks very much. Well, don't forget, we will have full coverage of the budget here on Sky News with Sophie Ridge presenting a special programme from 11 o'clock this morning, right through the budget and getting lots of reaction as well. And we want to hear your thoughts on the budget. You can call us now on 020 81 67 2200 to be part of a special phone-in programme to have your say and ask our experts with any questions you may have. You can watch Budget, Your Say, at 7 p.m. this evening here on Sky News. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of workers will walk out today in a national day of action timed to coincide with the budget. Up to 150,000 civil servants working across more than 100 government departments will be on strike for more pay. Today is the last of 3 days of strike action by junior doctors in England, which the British Medical Association says has been supported by more than 36,000 hospital doctors across the country. Around 10,000 members of the Rail, Maritime and Transport Workers Union will walk out for the 7th time in London since this time last year. ASLEF drivers are also taking part in their first strike on the London Underground since 2015. And teachers and university staff will be on the picket lines today. At least 250,000 teachers across England are expected to walk out, as well as 70,000 staff at universities across the UK. The Schools Minister says teachers have been offered talks to end the strikes.
Well, we wrote to the unions in February offering them very serious negotiations about pay. The only condition was that they pause strike action. And the National Education Union, unlike the nurses, refused to accept that. Had they accepted that offer, we would be in those negotiations right now, as the nurses are. So we want to have a settlement reached as swiftly as possible. We want to be around the table with all 4 unions, talking about pay and recruitment and retention and the workload of teachers. But we can't have those negotiations while strike action is happening.
Well, Alice Porter is at a picket line with teachers in East London this morning. And Alice, what are they saying to that they don't appear to be willing to get around the table and talk?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Gillian Keegan, she wrote to the teaching unions yesterday asking them to sit down and discuss pay and reforms. But as you were just hearing there, it was on the understanding that industrial action was called off. And the NEU say they could not agree to those preconditions and they only want to sit down at the table when a pay offer has been made. The government's position is very much, look, you've had a pay rise of 5% last year. We've put forward a 3% pay rise. But teachers are saying that it's simply not enough. They're wanting a pay rise that is above inflation, with many teachers struggling with the cost of living crisis, particularly those here in East London. So the government and teachers in England are very much at this stalemate. There has been progress made in Wales and in Scotland, where industrial action was paused. In Wales, where there was a revised pay offer and it was called off in Scotland. So progress has been made there. But today and tomorrow, we have got strike action taking place across England, which is meant to impact almost all schools. Here at Mossbourne Community Academy in Hackney, 2-year groups are not able to take place as normal because of the industrial action.
Alice, thank you. The United States is still at odds with Russia after military officials said a Russian fighter jet hit one of its unmanned surveillance drones in international airspace over the Black Sea. The Russian ambassador to Washington was summoned to give an explanation, with the two countries giving very different versions of what happened.
At approximately 7:03 a.m. Central European Time, one of the Russian Su-27 aircraft struck the propeller of the MQ-9, causing U.S. forces to have to bring the MQ-9 down in international waters. Several times before the collision, the Su-27s dumped fuel on and flew in front of the MQ-9 in a reckless and unprofessional manner. This incident demonstrates a lack of competence in addition to being unsafe and unprofessional.
You see that Ms. Catherine Donfrid has conveyed her concerns and United States concerns regarding this incident. And I hope that you have seen today remarks by Mr. Kirby and parole of State Department on this issue. Nothing new.
Well, our security and defence editor Deborah Haynes joins me now. The Russians are saying nothing new here, but how significant is what's happened?
It's hugely significant. It's the first time that we know of, at least, that the US and Russia have had direct contact with each other since the war in Ukraine began. And a US drone has been forced out of the sky as a result. It's landed in the Black Sea. It's not believed that there are American ships nearby, which means that Russian vessels would surely be trying to now find the wreckage of this drone and see if they can glean any intelligence from it. It also underlines the risk of unintended escalation around this conflict, where you have American, British, other NATO allies operating their aircraft. The Russians are also operating their own aircraft. And in this incident, according to the American account, the two Russian fighter jets, before one of them collided with the drone, were acting very aggressively and recklessly, dumping fuel onto the drone, perhaps to try to block out the camera. The Russians say that this drone was operating near the Crimean Peninsula, which hasn't been confirmed by the Americans. But again, aggressive, reckless action, according to the Americans, by the Russians, and then this leading to a direct collision. The Americans say that the Russian jet was also damaged. The Russians have not confirmed that. They said that there was no direct contact. They claimed that the US drone had some sharp maneuver and then uncontrolled dive into the sea, which doesn't sound very plausible. Either way, you came very close to a manned Russian jet crashing into the sea as well. So it really does underline the risk and how this whole conflict could spiral out of control without anyone actually intending it to.
Deborah, thanks a lot. Well, in other news this morning, more than 200 people have been killed in Malawi and Mozambique as Cyclone Freddy continues to cause devastation. Malawi's president has declared a state of disaster in the country's southern region. Cyclone Freddy first developed near Australia in early February and is set to be the longest ever recorded tropical cyclone. A 10th arrest has been made by police investigating the shooting of a senior police officer in Northern Ireland last month. A 45-year-old man was arrested in the Belfast area under the Terrorism Act. DCI John Caldwell was shot a number of times after coaching a youth football team in Omagh in County Tyrone. He remains in a critical but stable condition in hospital. A teenager has been arrested on suspicion of possessing an explosive near a railway station in High Wycombe. Police and bomb squad specialists were called to the scene yesterday afternoon when a member of the public reported concerns about a resident in the area. The 19-year-old lived on the road nearby and was detained. The former Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan is facing imminent arrest, accused of corruption charges. He says he's done nothing wrong and is the victim of a dirty tricks campaign by his political opponents. Well, our Asia correspondent Cordelia Lynch is in Karachi for us this morning. Cordelia, what impact is this having on the streets?
Well, there's a lot of tension outside Imran Khan's residence in Lahore. Still, there's been pitched battles throughout the night, still tear gas being fired outside his residence as we speak, and his party say that it feels even more intense now. Islamabad police moved to Lahore to try and arrest him yesterday, but there was a big groundswell of support from his team. And we saw a great deal play out there on the streets. There's deep concern. Imran Khan is accused of selling state gifts, something he denies. Now, this arrest is because of he hasn't yet appeared before court. They are trying to force his hand on that. But he says, and told me last night in an interview, that this is politically motivated. Take a listen.
They're doing everything to get out of the elections or get me out of the way. One way is to put me in jail. The other is to have me killed. I'm a believer, who believes that life and death is in Almighty's hands. So I'm not really, I'm in that way a bit fatalistic. So if I have to go to jail, I will. I'm mentally prepared. I've got my reading material ready.
Now, Imran Khan has said that he will appear before court on the 18th of March. We don't yet know if that has been accepted. His team is currently in court trying to get protective bail. We await to see the conclusion of that. But currently, this is an intense stalemate.
Cordelia, thanks very much. Well, let's return to the budget now. Chancellor Jeremy Hunt will set out his tax and spending plans for the years ahead later on this morning with a focus on growing the economy. Well, with me now is Justine Greening. She's the former Conservative Education Secretary and also former Economic Secretary to the Treasury. Good to have you here this morning. Thank you for coming in despite the strikes. A big expansion of childcare we're expecting today. Could this be a game changer for the Tories, do you think?
I think it's certainly going to be a key battleground at the next election. Labour have talked about bringing forward some ambitious plans. I think for parents, most importantly, for many, this will be a welcome change. There's no doubt that for a significant number of parents of very young children, the cost of childcare is prohibitive. I think the real challenge for Jeremy Hunt as Chancellor is almost not just this announcement, but then implementing it. How is the childcare sector really going to be able to expand to provide that extra capacity, and do the numbers make sense for many childcare providers who will say that really their challenge is that the amount they're being paid by the government per hour of childcare doesn't really match the costs of providing it.
Well, indeed, because when you were Education Secretary, the government brought in 30 hours for 3- and 4-year-olds, but there was concern that if it wasn't funded properly, that the costs would be passed on to those with younger children, and that happened. Do you think the government will get the funding right this time?
I certainly hope so. And one of the toughest areas introducing the policy originally was to work out that rate for providers, because there are so many different circumstances that they're in as businesses. It's actually quite hard getting one rate that will suit all of them in a sense. But broadly, this policy has been a success. I think it has absolutely supported often working women to get into work. I think this is now the next stage. It was always something, I think, on our agenda, even introducing the 30-hour provision, that you might want to go down the age range. So I think this is a welcome step forward. Implementing it's not going to be that easy, but actually, I think for many parents it will be good news.
Are they just nicking Labour's policy, though?
Oh, come on. I think the public just want to see change on the ground, and actually...
Is that a yes?
Well, I don't think it really matters as far as the public are concerned. No party's got a monopoly on good ideas. And I think if political competition means that the good ideas are taken and implemented, then that's good news for the public.
You mentioned women and getting women back into the workplace. It is really crucial, isn't it? What would be the economic benefit of getting a whole load of mums of 1- and 2-year-olds back into the workplace quickly, do you think?
I think it's twofold. Partly it's the skills gap that we got and obviously the workforce shortages, literally. I think the second thing is hopefully meaning that parents, and particularly women, often who this affects, that are already in work, don't perhaps have career disruption that they wouldn't now get if they're able to actually access childcare earlier. So I think it probably has a double benefit for both the economy, but also women being able to more easily continue in their careers once they've started a family, which I think, in terms of gender equality, is a really positive step as well.
You're really passionate about social mobility. Do you, looking ahead at what's trailed in this budget, is there anything in it that you think that's going to really make a difference?
Well, the one thing I really want to see is reform of the apprenticeships levy. It's not just about getting more people into the workforce, it's also about upskilling, reskilling and allowing more people access to opportunity, particularly younger people. And I think we all know how tough COVID has been for many people in the education system. So I think a sensible set of reforms to the apprenticeship levy would not only allow great employers that want to spend more of that levy reskilling and upskilling people to be able to do that, I also think it would provide a lot more opportunities for young people. And in the end, Jeremy Hunt, I think, is quite right to say this needs to be a budget for growth. That's what's being trailed. But the one thing that will really turbocharge growth in the UK is actually improving social mobility and making access to opportunity fairer in the future than it's been in the past. And that is fundamentally about a talent, a skills agenda. And that's what I really hope we hear a lot more about today as well.
What about public sector pay? Obviously, today is happening against the backdrop of all these strikes. The possibility that public sector pay increases could go up to around 5.5%, we think potentially in the budget. Would that be enough, do you think, to stave off strikes?
Well, it doesn't look like it at the moment. Obviously, the pay review body will look at almost the market economics of this. And I think at some stage, an agreement is going to have to be reached by the government. But when you look at some of those key shortages we've got in the public sector, whether it's teachers, whether it's in probation, whether it's in the NHS, actually, again, you look at people who have left the workforce, perhaps slightly older. I think we need to change our mindset on the fact that people come into careers and move up. Actually, people can reskill and retrain even well into their 40s and 50s and have successful long careers in some of these key roles that are really important for wider society.
And also potentially increasing the amount that they could put into their pensions. Do you think that will really encourage people like doctors perhaps who might have retired early, to come back to work?
All the evidence seems to suggest so, and it just seems a sensible step to me to make it easier for people who want to keep working to do that. And of course, post-COVID, with more hybrid working, actually this old-fashioned sense of retirement that one day you're working 5 days a week, the next day you've retired and you're doing no work. I think we all can see that as employers bring in generally more flexible work practices, there is a real opportunity for people to keep active, keep working, but also do a better, stronger job of providing for themselves once they get into older age.
We're also not expecting tax cuts for personal taxes. A proposed increase in corporation tax, we think, is still going to go ahead. How do you think a lot of Conservative backbenchers will feel about that? Do you think that enough else will be offered for Jeremy Hunt to square the sort of circle of discontent?
I think this is perhaps the most challenging issue for Jeremy Hunt. He's got this really tough call, hasn't he?
Whose fault is that?
His now boss, Rishi Sunak, actually introduced it as Chancellor, and many of the people who are now saying this is a terrible rise were part of Boris Johnson's government that introduced it. So I think the substance of it in practice for growth is that I get that corporation tax is going up. I think the plan is that you'll backfill that tax take with incentives for investment for companies, and so make it more targeted to drive growth. But actually, in a knowledge economy, a lot of that growth needs to come from upskilling, reskilling and talent. And so actually, the danger, I think, for Jeremy Hunt is he puts it all into incentives for companies to invest in things, technology, but there aren't the incentives there as well for companies to invest in people. And actually, that, to my mind, means you need a more measured change of the corporation tax, because often it's increasing tax that just literally means a company looks at its wage bill and thinks, well, I can't grow the staff that I need.
So pushing it up to 25 you don't think is necessarily the best idea?
I think there needs to be a balance, and there's one area that I do think Jeremy Hunt needs to think very carefully about, and that is for these mid-sized companies. So the headline rate is going up to 25% for companies with profits over $250,000. The 19% rate we've currently got remains for companies with profits 50,000 or less. But for those actually quite small companies earning 50,000 to $250,000 profits, they now have a rate of 26.5%. And so if you think these are the fledgling potential growth companies that are going to really drive the economy in the coming years, I think we really need to look at making sure those businesses are supported, because going from a rate of 19 to 26.5% is a huge rise for them to bear.
OK. Justine Greening, good to see you. Thanks very much for coming in.
Thank you.
Well, let's take a look at how the papers are interpreting what we're expecting to see today. They're all leading on the budget. The Financial Times expects Jeremy Hunt to announce increased investment in businesses in what's being described as a budget for growth. Crying out for help, reads the front of the Mirror, a message to the Chancellor to be fair to those who need it most. On the same subject, The Telegraph leads with Hunt faces revolt over tax rise in budget. The Guardian highlights the £4 billion worth of childcare funding expected to be announced for the parents of 1- and 2-year-olds in England. And The Times says more free childcare to get parents back into jobs. Still to come on the show, I'm going to be joined by the Secretary-General to the Public and Commercial Services Union, Mark Sawatka. And as teachers join the picket lines, I'll also be talking to Kevin Courtney, the head of the National Education Union. Still to come this morning, a new study has shown what we like and don't like in robots. We'll tell you more after the break. Now, robots can be good for us, they can be useful, but they have to look right. A Cambridge University study looking at how effective robots are shows that their physical appearance affects how people work with them. Workers didn't expect much from toy robots, but even robots that looked more human were often a letdown, apparently, because although they looked right, they couldn't have meaningful conversations. And people are expecting too much of their robots. Now, thousands of civil servants are walking out today, which of course coincides with Budget Day. I'm joined now by Mark Sawatka, the General Secretary at the Public and Commercial Services Union, which represents civil servants. Mark, thank you for coming in. Why today? Why strike on Budget Day?
Well, good morning. Well, we've been striking now since December because the government's own workforce has been given the lowest pay offer anywhere in the economy, 2%, even though 40,000 of them use food banks. 45,000 government workers claim benefits because they are so poorly paid. And astonishingly, today, the tax department, HMRC, that's on strike for the first time, a third of the entire department is now on the national minimum wage, £10.42 an hour for collecting tax, overseeing the minimum wage and enforcing tax regulation. So we're on strike today to draw attention to the fact that the government's treating its own employees worse than anyone else. And, of course, we're joining 7 other unions on strike today, meaning there's actually 600,000 public sector workers taking industrial action.
Your pay demands of around 10%. The government says it's just unaffordable. It's not a starting point for negotiations.
Well, there are no negotiations. I've met the minister twice. I've met cabinet officials numerous times. They tell us they're listening. The minister actually told me he was moved by the testimonies of his own staff that we gave him that said they were skipping meals, that people are living in poverty. But 2% is what they've given. Now, food inflation last week was 16%. Not the luxuries, not caviar. These are bread, eggs, milk, staples, 16%. Yet when you're on the minimum wage and you're getting a 2% pay rise, industrial action is the last resort. We've asked for 10% because that's what inflation was. But what we've really said to the government is put money on the table now and we will meet you. But they're refusing to do that.
There is a word that potentially in the government we may see the announcement of a 5.5% public sector pay rise. Would that be a sensible starting point that you could at least get round the table and start talking?
Or if the government came and said we want to start talking about 5.5% and they agreed that was going to be backdated because this pay rise we had of 2% came in March last year, then of course we would meet them to talk about it. We would say that 5.5% isn't enough. We'd certainly start talking around it. Our key demands are for the lowest paid. And if I was to tell you that we've just done a deal with an employer in Scotland for some of our public sector members that's delivered a £15 an hour minimum wage and has got pay rises between 10 and 29% over 2 years, 29% for the lowest paid, it tells you that if in Scotland you can make progress, if in Wales you can make progress, if our firefighters can make progress with local authorities, why is it only where it's the Conservative government at Westminster who makes the decisions is no progress being made anywhere?
So just to be clear, you are saying that a 5.5% rise would mean that you would get around the table, but only if it's backdated, because my understanding is the government's saying it won't backdate anything.
So we must have a backdated pay award because at the moment people have had 2% for the last year. That's unacceptable when inflation peaked at 13% during that period. And we wouldn't settle for 5.5%, but at least if the government said we're starting there with that money on the table, we, of course, would get into talks. Unfortunately, at the moment, they've said 2% is all you're getting. We will not talk to you. So now we're seeing 135,000 civil servants on strike today. But I can tell you that if after today the government still won't talk, later this week we will be announcing a significant escalation of that industrial action, which will really see, I think, disruption increase, because, frankly, not getting any pay rises is not an option for the people we represent.
But if the government do say, look, you know, you want 10, we'll start talking at 5.5, but forget backdated, isn't now the time to just say, right, let's just focus on the future and let's sit down and try and work something out?
Well, we've made it clear that we will turn up and meet them anytime. But what we're trying to be realistic and say is we cannot walk away from those talks with people having had a 2% pay rise when they're using food banks, when they're claiming benefits. I mean, I'm sure your listeners would be staggered to know if they go into a job centre, if they're getting a pension or a disability payment or universal credit, the people dealing with them are on the national minimum wage. People making decisions on asylum seekers, people who are collecting tax. 30% of an entire government department is on the national minimum wage. I think most people would find that a scandal and would understand, therefore, why 2% or even 5%, when your pay is that low, does not help you in a cost of living crisis.
Of course, historically, the civil service hasn't been amongst the best paid in society, but a lot of people would argue that the payoff is other benefits, very, very comprehensive pensions when they retire. And it's something that they would say, well, people know that when they go into the civil service.
Well, that's a fair point, because I started in the civil service 40 years ago in the South Wales Valleys in a social security office, and that was always the argument. But 40 years on, all of those extra things have been eroded. So now, for example, our pensions are far from gold-plated. In fact, the government had an independent valuation that told them people were paying 2% too much for their pension, but they refused to cut the pension contributions. So our pensions have been eroded, terms and conditions have been eroded, and the real proof of this point is over the last 10 years, because pay's gone down in real terms every single year, it's why now a third of the entire HMRC and the DWP departments, that's 47,000 staff, are on their minimum wage. They were not on the minimum wage 5 years ago. It's because their pay's gone down, everything else has gone up. And if people think that the government's own employees are now essentially getting the minimum wage for administering frontline services, I think most people would find that shocking and could see why we're taking industrial action.
Of course, you know, they are alongside lots of other people who have also seen their pays fall in real terms. It's not something that's just specific to the civil service, is it?
It's not, which is why so many unions are on strike. What I think is specific is we have the lowest offer, the lowest rates of pay. Other parts of the economy are not having so many minimum wage employees. And I repeat the point that when the government makes all these announcements in the budget today, it'll be civil servants who'll deliver it. We'll collect the tax. We will have to implement the new laws. We deliver the universal credit. We keep the transport system running. We check the passports at the borders. We have people in prisons. But for £10.42 an hour, when 40,000 are using food banks and skipping meals, it's a real scandal. And the government know this is the case, which is why if you think everyone else is going on strike when they've been offered 5 or 6%, I think most people could understand why with a 2% offer and those low rates of pay, this is really the last resort. And there will be a lot more of it unless the government recognise it's a shame on them that they are having such a level of in-work poverty in the civil service, yet they're turning a blind eye.
I can see how passionately this affects you. It's really emotional, isn't it?
It's tragic because I see these men and women who've dedicated their life to public service, who always go the extra mile. They were clapped in the pandemic. They went into work. There were people dying from COVID because they were in work delivering frontline services. Yet now they're claiming the benefits that they administer. They're going to the food banks with people in the communities that they live, but they're delivering government services. They are government employees. It's a national scandal, in my view. And the Chancellor, if he had anything about him today, would recognise it and give the money that's needed, which is not much, to give people a pay rise that means they can spend money in their local communities and that they're not living in poverty.
Mark Sawalka, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, teachers are also striking today as part of their ongoing dispute over pay. Joining me now, Kevin Courtney, Joint General Secretary for the National Education Union. Kevin, good to see you too. Surely these strikes can't go on for much longer, can they?
Well, what government should be doing is sitting round the table and making offers that can resolve the disputes so that there aren't any more strike action. Our members at this school and schools around the country are on strike today because they are defending children's education. They're seeing a situation where in school after school that we've got support assistants leaving, special needs support assistants leaving to take jobs in supermarkets because they're better paid, where we've got specialist classes without the specialist teachers, chemistry GCSE classes without teachers qualified in chemistry, where we've got successions of temporary teachers all doing a good job but where we can't hold on to permanent staff. And our members across the country are saying the government's got to invest in our children's education. So we don't want to have any more strikes, but we want the government to make serious offers that can resolve the dispute.
Scotland and Wales, though, have managed to reach an agreement with their respective governments. Why do you think you haven't?
Well, we have reached an agreement. Well, we're on the way to an agreement with Wales. I personally have been at meetings with the Minister in Wales, Jeremy Miles, talking about the situation around pay and funding in schools in Wales, and he's been willing to meet and to reach agreements. So far, Gillian Keegan has not been willing to do that. She's not making any offers to resolve the dispute. She's not making any offers to invest in our children's education. Let's hope that she will do that soon.
She said that she will talk and will get round the table if you pause the strike. So you're not willing to do that just to start talks?
Well, we didn't do that in Wales or in Scotland, and we've led to resolution. Now, Gillian Keegan's known the pattern of strike action that we've had for weeks and weeks and weeks. She could have been talking at any time to look for a resolution to this, but she has made no offers to resolve the dispute. That's what we're calling out for her to do, to sit down and talk and make offers that can resolve the dispute.
What's your message to a single parent?
Let me just say this.
Go ahead.
My message to single parent is we sincerely apologise for the disruption to their child's education today and the disruption to their home life and their working life, because we know this is a problem. But what we're seeing is that parents are actually supportive of the strike action because they see there's a greater disruption in their children's education happening because of the underfunding, because of the recruitment and retention problems. And that's what we're hearing from parents. And we're incredibly grateful for the support that parents are giving. I think today we'll see tens of thousands of teachers and parents marching through London demanding that there is a budget that invests in our schools and colleges and invests in this generation of children. This generation of children hit so hard by COVID, and we need to invest in their education right now. The government's turning their backs on them. They appointed Sir Kevin Collins to give them a recovery plan. He gave them a plan. They ignored it. He walked away. They need to invest in this generation of children right now.
Is there anything you could hear in the budget today that would make you cancel the strikes?
Absolutely. We don't mind how the offers come. So if there was an offer of funding schools and paying people properly who work in schools, then we could stop our strike action. It's more likely that they'll come through a talks process, and we are ready, willing and able to talk. But we think the pressure of our strike today, the big demonstration that we'll see in London, the degree of parental support, the fact that there are many members of the Conservative Party contacting us and telling us they support us. I put on my social media a letter from a member of ours who says he was a Royal Marine for 28 years before becoming a teacher, always voted for the Conservative Party, and is coming on the demonstration today because of how disappointed he is in his party's lack of investment in education. If I was the government, I'd be worried about that degree of support that our industrial action has from across the political spectrum.
OK, Kevin Courtney, Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union. Thank you very much. A striking image of a red fox has taken the top prize at this year's British Wildlife Photography Awards. Here is the winning shot. Pretty beautiful. More than 13,000 photographs were submitted into this year's competition, but Charlie Page has been chosen as this year's winner. He says he wants to show the devastation caused to local woodland and wildlife by an increasing industrial landscape. You can see the fox there obviously in front of the pylons behind it. Looks close up, almost like a painting. It's a really beautiful photograph. NASA has released an extraordinary image showing a dying star taken with its new space telescope. The observation was one of the first made by the Webb Space Telescope after its launch in 2021. The image shows gas and dust flung into space by a huge star, 15,000 light years away. Scientists say that this transformation is normally the last step before a star explodes. Well, let's return now to the budget. What will the Chancellor's own MPs want to hear from him? Well, Harriet Baldwin is with me. She's a Conservative MP and chair of the Treasury Select Committee. Thank you very much for coming in.
Morning.
Jeremy Hunt has perhaps ended up with a little bit more headroom than he might have expected when we were thinking about where this budget might be back in the autumn. Are we in the right place to be spending huge sums of money on things like childcare and defence?
We'll see what the figures are later, but he has been lucky over the course of the winter because, of course, when he budgeted in November, he was expecting energy prices to be higher than they have been. And so what I expect him to do today, and in fact one of the measures has just been announced, is to extend that price cap for households for a bit longer. That's been worth about £700 for households over the winter, should be worth about another £160 to households by the extension. Of course, that's really been helpful in tackling this big economic challenge that the Chancellor faces, which is the rate of inflation. And he will want to do things today, I think, that reduce inflation. He will want to do things that cut debt overall, and he will want to do things that grow the economy. And there'll be a real focus, I expect, today on growth.
But in terms of the nuts and bolts of the money, potentially public sector pay rises up by 5.5%, fuel duty freeze, £5 billion, energy bill help that we just talked about, that could cost £4 to £5 billion, £5 billion on defence, pension changes, green investment over 2 decades, £20 billion. The country's still not in an entirely stable economic state. Can we afford this?
Well, I think what he will do is he will make sure that at the end, when he sits down, the numbers do look better in terms of the outlook than they did before in terms of reducing the debt. That is definitely going to be one of his priorities. But he has had some good fortune. I've mentioned the fact that it was a warmer winter than he was expecting in November. But also he's made some of his good fortune because he stabilised the markets last November. And by stabilising the market, that means that the amount that the government has to pay in interest, that will be quite a bit lower than was expected by the Office for Budget Responsibility when he made his statement in November. So I think he will find that he is able to give some fairly generous measures to the British public while also focusing on that long-term debt level coming down.
So those are the things spending money on. One of the things that people may be interested in is pensions. The government is very keen to get people back to work, so we're seeing announcements on childcare and announcements on pensions. For those who don't understand, it is complicated, but if you have a lot of money and you've managed to save a lot in your pension, there's an upper limit. That could be increased, we understand. Some have said, though, that this is really just going to affect those who are really very well off. Is this something that the government should be focusing on?
Well, I think he's got his mind on hospital consultants and hospital doctors, senior doctors,
and
who
bankers.
are in some of these big public sector schemes, which are very generous compared to what people in the private sector tend to get these days. So I think you're absolutely right that he will be looking at work more generally. So, since the pandemic, we have had a recovery in the economy, but there are still not as many people who have returned. There's more economic inactivity than there was before. And also there's a lot of vacancies in the economy. And one of the things that he will be hearing is that people have retired earlier than they would do normally because of these pension limits, particularly in the NHS. And he will want to make sure that the NHS workforce, remains there until later. So I think that's one of the things he will do. But I think there'll also be focus on work. You were covering the childcare offer earlier, and that'll be to help more people return to the workforce after having a child.
But counterintuitively, it couldn't also be the case that if you encourage more people to put more money away, then they could also retire early as well, because they'll have put more money away, and so they'll be able to stop working earlier.
Yeah, I think he will have to look at it in the round, and we'll see what the detail is in the measures. Obviously, next week on the Treasury Committee, we'll have in the sort of official commentators, and then we will have the Chancellor himself in front of the committee. We'll be able to probe on some of the details. But I think the overall theme will be growing the economy and helping more people return to work and taking away some of those barriers and disincentives that exist in the benefit and tax system that prevent people from doing those extra hours.
Public sector pay, a big subject, lots of strikes today. We were told a while ago that the government wouldn't increase public sector pay over 5%. Now being trailed, it could go up to 5.5%. The reason that they put that 5% figure was because they thought anything over that would fuel inflation. Would you be concerned if they announced a 5.5% increase?
Well, it is the Bank of England's job to keep inflation down, and I hope that we see the inflation rate return to the Bank of England target, because inflation is obviously the worst tax on the whole economy. It's the worst tax, particularly on the very poorest in society. So it's absolutely essential that inflation gets back down to its target level. And I think in that context, the Bank of England would not want to see public sector pay spiralling in line with inflation, because then you get into what's known as a wage price spiral. It gets much harder to get inflation back down again.
Realistically, what impact do you hope that this budget would have on interest rates?
Well, I think you can hope that it will continue to calm the markets in the way that November's statement calmed the markets. I think we are in an inflationary environment. It is crucial that inflation gets back in its box. And so you can't rule out the Bank of England having to raise rates further than the 4% that they're currently at. But the Chancellor will be very mindful of that with the measures that he announces today.
OK, Harriet Baldwin, Chair of the Treasury
Jane.
Select Committee. Good to speak to you. Thanks very much. Well, lots more chat about the budget coming up in the next hour. We're going to be talking to Labour's Pat McFadden as we build up to today's budget. We're also going to be talking to wildlife photographer as well. So lots still to stay tuned to Sky News this morning. Don't go away.